Hello and welcome back to Sustainable AF. In this first series, we're taking you on a guided tour of the Sustainable Development Goals, or the SDGs, a framework designed to help us build a more sustainable future.
I'm Felicia, I'm an author and entrepreneur, and I teach climate change and energy transition at SOAS, the University of London.
And I'm Alex, a former fixed income specialist, and I'm now building a regenerative agriculture startup.
This week, we are discussing SDG 16, and that is peace, justice, and strong institutions. This and the final SDG goal, which is around partnerships, is slightly different from the other 15. They're usually focused around one particular issue, like hunger or health, education, even good jobs, sustainable cities, or climate.
It's something we say all the time, but bears repeating again on this topic. The effects of climate change extend beyond the environmental impacts in a complex intersection with economics, social development, and security. Climate pressures adversely influence resource availability, affect population dynamics, and strain societal institutions. We're all humans with our own decision-making powers, but not always access to the same information, access to power, or the process of government or economic activity.
It's also important to remember that when we're talking about peace, justice, and strong institutions, there are individual elements to that, but really it's about the big questions. Why aren't we solving the climate crisis? Why aren't all the necessary resources being poured into it if the science says that's necessary? And that's because climate change and sustainability are both political economy issues. We actually have the technology, we have the money, and we have the knowledge to solve the world's problems today. We just have to agree to do it. And that seems to be where the system falls over.
Yeah, absolutely. It doesn't matter whether it's fossil fuel companies pitching the argument that the solution is an individual's choice, which speaks to the market paradigm of the independent actor, or traditional industry capturing regulators to ensure that they don't have to pay to pollute, or political arguments that the welfare state is a weakness. The reality is that there isn't peace. Even strong institutions have weaknesses, and justice isn't the same for all. You just have to read the news to know that's not true.
It's also really challenging because these are global problems that have to be addressed locally. And most countries don't want to accept rules from the outside. I've heard people talk about the UN sustainability agenda as an attempt to build a world government. Highly unlikely if you think about the fact that in the UN, all countries have to agree to any particular agreement, and they most certainly don't do that. If you think about it, the UN has no enforcement capacity. Even the international treaties that have been agreed to date are pretty much voluntary. And the hope is generally that collective action will drive further collective action.
We know that climate change has only recently become salient due to heat domes over North America and Turkey. Entire regions like California's wine industry are suffering from lack of water, and parts of the world are on fire or flooding, and people with money and power are seeing the impacts of this extreme weather that we predicted 25 years ago. So it's become something to pay attention to today, and it's not a problem of tomorrow.
So we often talk about saliency, about the importance of something in terms of the pandemic. COVID happened everywhere to everyone, so we had to pull together to solve the problem. Climate change has always been one of those things that people thought was distant in time or happened to other people in places far away. What everyone seems to forget is that we live in a globalized and interconnected society. And in the same way that no one could escape COVID, no one is going to escape the impact of climate change.
And that's why peace, justice, and strong institutions matter, because that's how we ensure that our societies are resilient and stable. Unequal societies throughout history have not survived crises well. We need these things not simply because they help us build better lives for the majority of the population, but because they are going to be absolutely critical in facing the next crisis, whenever it may be.
So these last two goals, 16 and 17, they're really the foundation, the glue that's needed to make the other 15 even a possibility. Because imagine trying to solve hunger in a war zone. or solve the climate crisis under a dictatorship, or effectively deploying climate finance in a corrupt nation.
Peace, justice, and strong institutions are completely integral to anything moving forward and working. We have many different types of systemic issues, which range from inherent systemic inequality, the dominance of the market paradigm, with the idea that the individual return is more important than the overall social stability, as well as fraud and, of course, corruption.
So peace is important because you can't make changes to the way the economy works if you're at war, while at the same time, conflict over resources can often lead to fighting. Justice, or rather the belief that justice applies to all of us equally, is fundamental to succeeding. We can't build a better future unless everyone is considered equal under the law. And that means revisiting issues around inequality, fairness, and valuing each individual as themselves.
But justice can't exist without robust and independent institutions that are able to hold the power to account. Strong institutions are necessary to hold individuals, businesses, and governments to account. Creating a level playing field, a shared place to start, is what matters. It's not about saying that everyone is the same, has the same capacities and talents. It's about saying we should all have access to the same frameworks that enable us to be our best selves.
And again, we're talking about access. We've talked about this a lot. If everyone doesn't have access to justice, then there is no justice. And one of the things that matters is that all of these elements play out at every scale and level of society, and they matter both domestically and internationally. The thing to remember is that we need to address not simply the everyday issues of normal life, but actually, how we address climate change and the need to build more resilient societies. And that means talking about climate justice, the moral and ethical questions about the impact and our responses to climate change. We might do something more specific on this in a later pod, but it's important to keep these things in mind.
There are important questions around who gets to decide what access means, what it means to become our best selves. It seems clear that dictatorship is a potential problem for peace, justice, and strong institutions. But are we talking about political dictatorship, a religious one, or even an economic one? Because all of these mean different things to people living under them.
There are also fundamental questions about how you achieve peace, something the human race has so far failed to actually achieve. Justice and strong institutions can't just be made to happen. Who has the power? Who decides the goals? Who implements the changes and enforces new approaches? We know we could solve the climate crisis by cutting the world's population in half. Even if your picture of that is Marvel's Thanos and the snap, no one wants to be on the losing side of that decision. Now, in terms of the bigger picture, there are lots of reasons why we need to achieve SDG 16 and these different targets, these goals. Overall, they've been broken down into a bunch of different elements. But in the same way that the SDG framework itself is interrelated, these three actually have an effect on each other.
Yep, these targets provide a framework within which we can work towards achieving the overall goal. They range from reducing violence to promoting the rule of law, ensuring equal access to justice, and more. And you can find all of these details on the UN's website. There is little doubt that we're no way near on track to achieving these universal goals by the end of the decade. But every step we take towards achieving them helps move all the other goals forward as well.
So let's talk a little bit about why these goals matter and why we should care so much about achieving them. We've talked about how it matters that they're closely connected, but this is especially important when we're looking at the overall impact and role of risk multiplication that climate change has to play.
So now let's look at peace. Why we care. The most obvious challenge out of all three of these is peace. Peace is necessary for any effective form of international cooperation. Countries just won't work together when they're busy protecting themselves. It seems obvious that we'll never be able to implement positive change in a war zone. It might sound really simple, but ensuring people aren't being killed is the first step in any attempt to address a more sustainable future.
If you think about it, a failure of peace can upend any attempt to improve livelihoods or responses to change. While the impacts of climate change are felt globally, it's true that people in low and middle income countries are often affected most heavily. Now, partly this is due to a high dependency on, climate sensitive agriculture and agrarian economies, but it's also due to failures in governance and a lack of institutions that are equipped to cope with the complex impacts of climate change. So for this, justice and strong institutions matter. Conflict, insecurity, weak institutions, and limited access to justice remain the greatest threats to sustainable development.
Totally. And the implications of a lack of peace are so far-reaching, it can also destroy a society for generations. How are we supposed to work on improving education, healthcare, economic growth and development when children are at risk every day? It just doesn't work. And the number affected is huge. Approximately 28.5 million primary school aged children who are out of school live in conflict affected areas. That's a huge amount of children, and a huge amount of that doesn't even consider issues like kidnapping. Talk about Boko Haram in Nigeria and the school children, or the associated problem of children soldiers in similar areas like Somalia, Yemen, South Sudan, and many more.
And the thing about conflict is such problems aren't contained. Conflict can also lead to displacement, which is destabilizing for the countries where refugees flee. In 2018, the number of people fleeing war, persecution, and conflict was over 70 million. That was the highest level recorded by the UN in almost 70 years. That creates instability in the home country and in the countries they flee to.
And these conflicts can be about country, resources, race, even climate change. But the reasons are often and really complex and hard to unpick. Ultimately, it's about using force to achieve an objective. And it can be about economic or territorial gain, religion, nationalism, defense. There's so many issues.
One of the things that really matters, though, is you have to make people want to fight. Years ago, I read John Ronson's The Men That Stare at Goats, and he was talking about how the US government found that often soldiers would initially fire above the heads of enemies because killing people goes against natural human tendencies. So a lot of what needs to happen for war to happen is the demonization of the other, finding somebody to blame, anything that demagogues can turn into a fear and that they can blame problems on.
And we can see this transcend history with tyrannical leaders like Hitler, Stalin, Pol Pot. Think about places where this is played out on race. Rwanda with the genocide, South Africa and India versus place riots and the apartheid.
Yeah, and this is a thing that has an impact, again, both internationally and internally. So again, thinking about climate change in fragile and conflict-affected areas, climate-related security problems can create negative feedback loops. What this does is trigger this spiral of climate disaster and conflict. And the thing we also need to remember is the consequences of this interplay is not just limited to violent conflict, but it also builds up other types of insecurity, which includes organized crime, armed group activity, as well as sexual and gender-based violence.
And what worries me a lot for you is we've seen the likes of the climate crisis play into climate migrancy from the likes of Syria into wealthy countries like Germany, Spain, Italy, and the effect that's had. What happens when we have mass flooding like we have in Germany, Italy, Spain? Where do people go? What does this picture look like? It's not just poor people leaving poor countries to go to rich countries. The rich countries are being affected as well now.
But this is actually what I meant when we talked about saliency, because climate change has been something that people with the money in the global north, people with the money and the power and the technology have always communicated this as something distant, something that was going to affect other people in places far away. What you're talking about, it's not even just the refugee crisis and the migration crisis. It's the reality that climate change impacts are beginning to hit home in countries which basically had the power to act and change what they did, and they didn't do it. I remember reading a report years ago warning that floods were going to be incredibly bad in the Rhine region because so many cities had been built over and there was nowhere for the water to go. These are the kinds of things that need to be addressed, and things like sustainable cities and other SDGs come into play.
Yeah. If 2021 showed us one thing, it is the cost of inaction is really going to bite hard. And we need to be focusing on frameworks like the SDGs, like regenerative business models, if we want to literally keep our heads above water.
Literally.
But back to peace. What's needed to create and sustain peaceful societies is often the same as what's needed to provide all the other positive outcomes that the SDGs are out there to achieve, as we just said, basically. And really, it's based around three things: thriving economies, better performance on ecological measures, and high levels of resilience and adaptability to change.
Because the thing is, people aren't likely to go to war if they've got a good job and their children are doing well and they're comfortable and they're happy. If you actually protect your environment and your ecology, you're not going to have the same resource problems. And if you have resilience and adaptability, you can respond to the problems that hit you. I think one of the things that's really interesting and worth taking a look at is the Positive Peace Report, which actually does an analysis of the relationship between peace and societal stability. Only in a stable society do you have the ability to respond to a crisis.
The problem is that building and sustaining peace requires a large number of society-wide improvements, progressing in concert with one another over long periods of time. And this is difficult. Different parts of the social system push towards or away from peace, which is one of the reasons why it is so important to address change on a systematic level. And that brings us to justice.
So for justice, the rule of law and development, in fact, have a significant interrelationship, and they're mutually reinforcing, which makes it absolutely essential for sustainable development at the national and international level. Corruption, for example, is endemic all over the world, no matter what different countries want to say. Some forms are obvious, some are not, but they share the same elements of eroding trust, eroding equality, weakening institutions, and creating an environment where peace and justice cannot flourish.
Experts agree that corruption is a systemic issue which involves society as a whole. It involves both private and public sectors. It involves education, the basis of the economic system, the regulatory system, how our economy is run, and generally the ethical values which are in place.
And for the SDGs to work, this has got to change. Now, I'm not saying we know how to stop corruption, because we don't have an answer. But there are approaches that if you change those, if you have strong institutions, if you have a rule of law, you are more likely to be able to address things like organised crime. I mean, organised crime and the role it plays in terms of finance and power, issues like child labour, slavery, human rights and racial justice, they all play out around the world every day. They seem to be accepted by so many, and corrupt systems have no means of dealing with this.
Justice means broader things too. We've talked in previous pods about the importance of having access to society, access to education, to government, to justice, to economic activity. Yet the births of around 1 in 4 children under the age of 5 worldwide are never officially recorded, depriving them from proof of legal identity, crucial for the protection of their rights, for access to justice and social services. And again, there are huge disparities between what happens in the global north and the global south. Listen to this. Birth registration has occurred for 73% of children under 5, but only 46% of sub-Saharan African children have their births registered. How do you create a society when there's no census?
Well, I think this brings us to this idea of inequality, because we're talking here about inequality of access. And inequality is incredibly important because it plays a fundamental role in access to justice. If we don't actually have equal access to justice, is it justice? Why should power or money or skin colour or birth mean that you're more likely to get a rap on the knuckles than a prison sentence for the same crime?
We've talked about inequality a lot, and it's really dangerous in terms of social stability. We've focused in previous pods on economic inequality and the dangers that that causes. But there are so many other different issues at play here. It is critical to take into consideration multidimensional factors such as social mobility, gender equality, livelihood infrastructure, technology access, the voice of civic society, privacy, social and environmental protections, progressive tax laws, and labour rights when examining how societies perform on reducing inequalities and serving public interest. As we said earlier, we have the roadmap here of how we do it. We just need to get on with doing it.
Yeah, and that's the thing. Mitigating inequality demands a mix of both bottom-up and top-down changes that recognises the fact that social and economic systems that aggravate inequality are actually a matter of choice. Depending on where you stand, addressing this can mean implementing a minimum wage, universal healthcare, transparent and accountable policies and investing, sharing the fundamentals of knowledge creation and collaboration. The thing is, this works at an international level and at a domestic level.
There are other specific issues which are exacerbating the problem today. One of the most important is the digital divide, which really became apparent during the pandemic. It's not just as simple as the gap between children who could have access to digital education and those who couldn't. It's about access, again, to information, to services, to democratic functions, basically.
And again, this differential speed of internet penetration and access to technology actually amplifies existing problems. And again, both internationally and domestically. Misinformation, whether it's about COVID, about climate change, about justice, is rife everywhere. And social media exacerbates this with algorithms that allow falsehoods to be spread, that keep people in an echo chamber of their own opinions, and a sort of cultural growing suspicion of expertise and scientific knowledge, which is incredibly counterproductive in the modern age. Risks and uncertainties are emerging around how and where and how we live, which include threats to individual rights, to social justice, and to democracy, and they're all amplified by this digital divide.
Fundamentally, many of the technology solutions we have to help the mitigation of the downsides of poverty, education, climate change, healthcare, and encourage the achievement of the SDGs requires digital access. Fundamentally, many of the technology solutions we have to help mitigate the downsides of poverty, education, climate change, healthcare, and encourage the achievements of the SDGs require digital access. At its most basic level, communication, education, and collaboration are the most powerful tools we have to effect peaceful change. So we need to find ways of dealing with this. None of the SDGs can be achieved unless people are able to communicate their dreams, concerns, and needs locally, nationally, regionally, and globally.
So that brings us to strong institutions and why we should care. It might seem self-evident, but you need strong institutions if you are to enforce the rule of law, justice, and equity for all. You also need it in order to implement international agreements as well as local regulations. Think about the stories we hear every year about how bribery is considered part of doing business in some parts of the world, and how that can lead to power and money being fixed among a small group of people. It also leads to international human rights being violated and more.
You just can't have effective justice without strong institutions. Among the institutions most affected by corruption are, unfortunately, the judiciary and the police. It doesn't simply lead to injustice, but it undermines work being done towards sustainable development. Corruption, bribery, theft, and tax evasion cost some 1.26 trillion for developing countries per year. This amount of money could be used to lift those who are less than $1.25 a day, above $1.25 a day for at least 6 years. And don't even get me started on the $100 billion that was promised to developing nations from developed nations in the Paris Agreement that just hasn't materialized. It's an arsehole move.
And I think one of the things that's really important when thinking about that is actually it's about what is the institution doing? What is the capacity for an agreement to be enforced? How do people make decisions? And I think that's really important as well in terms of strong institutions, because what they do is enforce the laws that societies think matter in terms of how we live. Now, that can mean stopping slavery, ensuring the end of child labour and the like, but it's also central to the ability of any society to address climate change and respond to its impacts. If there are weak institutions, for example, it doesn't matter if the government demands reporting on climate risk, no one will care. If there are regulations and laws around stopping pollution, but they're not enforced, those regulations and laws might as well not exist.
It's also about ensuring that you have a functioning economy. This is really important. If we see one of the 3 requirements for peace as economic stability, we need strong institutions to enforce the protection of property rights, as well as effective law enforcement and efficient bureaucracies, so that they can do things like come together and tackle a global pandemic. And this goes hand in hand with a broad range of norms and civic mores.
And the thing about this is that social norms are so important. What they are is how we decide as people what sort of world we want to live in, what's important. Weak institutions mean that anyone with power, position, or money can skew the system towards what they want. In many places, dysfunctional and predatory institutions are often the norm itself. In theory, government institutions play an important role in shaping and incentivizing the way in which society and organizations behave by setting the rules of the game. But the real question is whose rules and what game?
Yeah, government is in place to serve society, but it certainly doesn't feel like that a lot of the time. In today's world, it is hard to understand why someone would be against racial justice, but those entrenched in positions of privilege, so entrenched that they don't even understand what it means to be privileged, often see attempts to level the playing field as a tax on them. Privilege doesn't mean you're not poor. It just means that if you're poor and white, you're less likely to get arrested for a minor offence than if you're black and poor. It's about bias embedded in the system. This has to change.
So strong institutions need to be independent and robust, but to be effective, they're also going to have to find a way to address these embedded biases. Whether it's about social justice and respect, the right to peaceful protest, or even how to address systemic racism, sexism, blaming the poor for not working hard enough and assuming that people with no access to education have got the same chances as those who've been given a great education. We need to be grateful for the institutions we do have, but insist that they get better. In the end, economic privilege allows people to pay lip service to change, but without really doing anything much. Rich white people might say Black Lives Matter, but who's voting for a change in representation? This is one of those situations where you have to put your money where your mouth is. A strong institution should mean that these kinds of differences don't matter, but that's not always the case.
And of course, strong institutions are vital in terms of supporting the implementation of international agreements. And that means global agreements. And that means globally agreed environmental goals. According to UNEP, in the past 60 years, 40% of conflicts have been tied to natural resources, and these are twice as likely to relapse into conflict within the next 5 years. And we've got to stop that happening if we're going to build effective, accountable, and inclusive sustainable development from all. We've shown in previous pods how aligning with natural resources to regrow them is better for bottom line conflict, basically everything, rather than fighting over resources.
And I think one of the things that we really do have to bring up, even if I don't have an answer for it, is the can of worms that's sort of part of the idea of strong institutions. What is it that makes an institution strong? Who has the right to decide what those institutions should do? It's also important to remember that just because an institution is strong, it doesn't mean that people are. Individuals can abuse power and misuse the trust of the public, regardless of whether or not that institution is sound. This is all about, I hate to say it, but it's the underlying philosophy of who gets to make the decisions.
So to conclude this bad boy, as usual, we've ended up talking about how complex this goal is and how many different elements are needed to be addressed in order to achieve any change. At its heart, it might be about the delicate nature of democracy, shown in how action on climate change is hostage to political wins. See this in Trump versus Biden, information and education, fighting back against big tech propaganda, and that's related to peace. Just look at the suggestions of Russia supporting Trump, algorithms to promote clickbait, and information bubbles, tailored news that means you only see what supports your existing worldviews, which is totally a negative thing to happen.
And then there's the whole problem that we're talking about, the importance of peace, but you've also got to fight for what you believe in. So how do you square that circle? And maybe what we're really talking about is the importance of stability. Maybe the ability to stand up for what you believe in is not only how we change the rules and norms of our society, but the definition of what it means to have a peaceful society. Things like the civil rights movement, allowing women rights over their own bodies, that would never have happened without people standing up and saying, this is not right, we need to change the system.
Now, this brings us back to the question about what it is we want. Many people don't want to see change because they can't see the damage being caused. But how do you implement change without upending people's independence? The UN is a strong institution, but is it? Yeah, but is it a bit of a paper tiger? That's not actually that strong, as it doesn't have any.
Doesn't have enforcement powers.
It doesn't actually have any enforcement powers. For an effective, strong institution, it needs to be more like, let's say, the Bank of England, that has enforcement powers, that has a rigid enough hold over the market that people stand up and listen to it, and do not go against it. And if they do, they get really reprimanded. We are seeing progress, but is it fast enough? We're seeing huge improvements in many of these goals, but it's still not a world that's fair to everyone. There is loads of injustice, death, and destruction. How do you affect change without trampling on people's rights? Who gets to decide what is right?
And there are many, many problems with democracy, but it does seem better than the alternative. But what if the alternative is a dictatorship that can actually just state, right, we're going to implement climate laws and boom, that's done. Everyone has to do exactly as they're told. Which approach is going to work and which is going to end up being better for everyone? We may argue that the UN doesn't have enough power through enforcement, but there are conspiracy theories out there. I remember someone talking to me about how Agenda 21 was an attempt to overthrow this, to the guy who was talking to me to attack his lifestyle and his approach and his world. People, conspiracy theorists, see it as a backdoor to some form of control.
Not going down a conspiracy tunnel here.
No.
But a lot of people's lifestyle do need to change because fundamentally they're unsustainable. And you either do that organically because you recognize that it's not a good idea, as we're seeing civic society do, all over the world, but there's also a group of people that just don't care. How do you push those people towards a more sustainable way of life that will leave the planet in a better way that they found it?
Yeah, but part of that is conversation. Part of that is, that's what drove us to do this. It's to actually say, what is actually being discussed? Why does it matter? How does it connect to everything else? Do we actually understand what's going on? Are we being told? Is it being explained? Is there a better way of doing things that still allows us to be ourselves?
Totally. I would argue yes. But this goal raises more questions than it answers, for sure. But these discussions have got to be had if we're going to find a way forward. We need to decide who we are as humans and take responsibility to address these issues and not blame or ostracize other people.
Yeah, so not many answers for you this week, but we certainly hope that raising some of these questions has given you something to think about. If you have any thoughts or questions about the topic, catch up with us on Instagram. And if you're interested in what we have to say, then like us, rate us, and subscribe.
Next time, it's our last one. For this series anyway, we'll be talking about SDG 17, and that is partnerships for the goals, which is about how we share knowledge and technology, mobilize investment and build partnerships between governments, the private sector and civic society. Thanks, guys.
Thanks, guys. See you soon.